Hi guys. I'm going to recap a 2016 American drama movie, called Manchester by the Sea. This movie tells the story about a man who is forced to go back to his hometown, to take care of his 16-year-old nephew after his brother passed away. But there's something from his past that still haunts him in that town. What do you think that made him move out from the town that he was born and raised in? Let's find out. Lee Chandler was born and raised in a town by the sea called Manchester. He grew up alongside his brother Joseph Joe Chandler. There's only the two of them, so they're really close with each other. One beautiful afternoon, Lee is on a fishing trip with Joe and his son, Patrick, with Joe's boat. Lee is also close to little Patty, just like now he's trying to convince the boy that he's better than his father. Now, Lee is working as a janitor at 4 apartment buildings to support his life. The apartment's tenants often complain about their life problems to Lee, and he often tries to give them solutions. However, he can't stand if they keep on complaining upon receiving his solutions and sometimes replies to them in a not so polite way. A tenant complains to Lee's boss about this, but his boss already knows Lee's behavior and just let him go with a warning. After work, Lee is sitting on a bar when a girl is hitting on him. The girl accidentally spills her drink on Lee's shirt and then tries to make it up to him, but Lee doesn't even show emotions on his face and basically ignores her. After some time sitting alone, Lee decided to approach the two guys seated across from him and punch them out of nowhere. He claims that they were looking at him, even though they already explained that they don't. Lee still punches at them. The next morning, Lee is shoveling the snow when he gets a call from his friend back home, George. His brother Joe is now in the hospital after suddenly passing out. After arranging for some of his co-workers to cover for his shift, Lee drives his car to the hospital Joe brought in. Unfortunately, the street is busy at this hour and Lee didn't make it in time to the hospital. Joe had already passed away. In the hospital, Lee meets with George and Dr. Muller. The reason for Joe's sudden death is cardiac arrest. Joe has already had some issue with his heart for the last couple years, which makes his heart weak. Lee then asks George to inform his uncle, Donnie, who he just found out already moved out to Minnesota, and also to inform his ex-wife, Randy. Lee and Dr. Muller goes downstairs to the morgue to see Joe. Lee then remembers the first time when they found out about Joe's heart condition. Lee, Joe, Joe's wife Elise, and their dad were listening to Dr. Bethany explaining that Joe was having coercive heart failure. The room went silent after the doctor said that usually patients only have 5 to 10 years to live after getting diagnosed. In the present, Joe is now seeing his brother's body pale and lifeless, and he can't help it but to hug his only brother one last time. Back in the afternoon, the three of them went fishing. Joe was teaching Patrick how to fish properly, and telling him shark jokes. When the fish finally took the bait, Patrick excitedly pulled the fishing rod, while Lee and Joe jokingly told him that it was a shark. After they were done with the fishing trip, Lee got home and greeted his oldest daughter, Susie, who was playing in the living room. He also went to his wife, Randy, who was in the bedroom because she had been feeling sick. There was also his second daughter, Karen, playing on the bedroom floor, and his baby son, Stanny, in his crib. After taking off his shirt, Lee jumps on the bed and lays on top of Randy, kissing and hugging her tightly. Despite her best effort to get him off of her, Lee still won't move from his wife. After signing Joe's belongings in the hospital, Lee drives to Manchester to pick up Patrick also to inform him about his dad. But he then gets informed from Patrick's teacher that he's not in school, because he's in a hockey practice right now. When Lee arrives at the hockey rink, Patrick is wrestling with his teammate. But when he spots Lee on the side of the ring, he stops and approaches him. Lee has to sign some papers in the hospital, so he asks Patrick if he wants to see his father while they're there. After thinking about it the entire ride, Patrick agrees to see his dad. He goes to the morgue, but can't stand looking at his deceased father for long. At home, Patrick invites his friends and girlfriend, Sylvie, over to distract his mind. After his friends left, Patrick goes to Lee's room to ask him if his girlfriend can sleep over. Even though Patrick hesitates at first, he also says that he wants to inform his mom about his dad, but Lee thinks otherwise. Flashback to one evening when Lee, Joe, and Patrick got home to find wasted Elise laying on the sofa with only a shirt on. Not wanting his son to see his mom in that state, Joe asked Lee to get Patrick upstairs while he got a blanket to cover her up. In the present, Lee is on the phone with the funeral home arranging Joe's funeral service. Then, Sylvie and Patrick join him at the table. She grabs herself some breakfast in the kitchen just like she's been doing it often. She also doesn't like Lee talking about Joe's funeral in front of Patrick and tells him to do that somewhere else, even though Patrick doesn't mind it at all. After school, Lee and Patrick go to the lawyer's office to read Joe's will. To Lee's surprise, Joe has left Patrick's custody to him. The lawyer is also surprised because he assumes that Joe already discussed it with Lee. He then explains that Joe has left money for Lee to move his stuff out from Boston to Manchester, so he can stay with Patrick there. Flashback to when Lee and a group of his friends were hanging out in his basement. When they were going too loud, Randy came and warned them to quiet down. But the guys didn't take her seriously, so she ended up kicking them out of the house. A while after that, Lee decided to run to the mini store to grab some beers. On his way back, He could hear sirens from his house's direction. Lee was standing there watching his house burn down in a big fire, while Randy was screaming at all of their children that are still in the house. Lee was accompanied by Joe, talking to the police while his children's bodies were collected from the house. Lee broke down seeing his children in body bags. At the police station, Lee was giving his statement to the police while Joe waited for him outside. That night after all his friends left, Lee went upstairs where his children slept, and it was freezing there. But he couldn't turn on the heater because Randy has sinus and it makes her head hurt. He ran out of beer so he wanted to buy some at the mini-mart. Before he left, he lit the fireplace to warm up the house. He was so wasted that he walked 20 minutes each way. But halfway there, he realized that he hadn't put a screen on the fireplace, but thought it wasn't a big deal and kept walking to the mini-mart. The police then freed him since his action was considered an accident. Leaving the interrogation room, Lee stole a gun from a police officer that passed by him. He held the gun to his head, but thankfully all the people there quickly restrained him. The guilt of accidentally killing all of his children has haunted him ever since, making him want to leave the city and forget about it all. Back to the present, Lee and Patrick are on their way to the car from the lawyer's office. Lee is already not in the mood after remembering the dark days of his life, and Patrick talking about his father's boat didn't make it better. Lee plans to sell that boat because they'll be moving to Boston, but Patrick doesn't want to sell it since it's his father's legacy, nor he wants to move to Boston. A random man passes by them and kind of insults Lee, which doesn't help their situation. They end up cursing at each other until Patrick breaks it off. They went into the harbor to meet George and see the boat. The boat's engine is in a really bad condition and it sure will break down at some point. Lee tries to explain that they don't have the money for a new engine and it'll be better to sell it. But of course Patrick still insists that they keep the boat. Patrick also doesn't want to move to Boston, or go join Uncle Donnie in Minnesota. He suggests that he move in with her mother. She sent him an email last year and he believes she won't mind having him. But then Lee reminds him that his mother is an alcoholic and his father wouldn't want that. Next, they go to the funeral home. They arrange to bury him in the spring, since the ground is frozen in the winter. Patrick didn't like this idea. It freaks him out that his dad will be in the freezer for the next 3 months. He tries to find a solution so that his dad can be buried soon, but Lee explains to him that it's nearly impossible. After picking Patrick's band stuff in the house, Lee drops him in his other girlfriend's house, Sandy. When Lee comes to pick Patrick up, Sandy's mom comes up to tell him that they haven't finished their work yet. She also offers him to join for dinner while he waits, but Lee turns down the offer and decides to just come back again later. After picking up Patrick again, Lee sits in front of the TV watching a hockey game. Then, the phone rings and he goes quiet after realizing the caller. It's his ex-wife, Randy, calling to offer her condolences and asks if it's okay for her to join the funeral service. She also tells him that she's pregnant now, which really surprises Lee. At the funeral service, Randy comes with her new partner and greets Patrick before she goes to Lee and introduces the two of them. After the services, Patrick asks Lee if he can invite Sylvie to sleep over, but Lee doesn't give him the permission. He then follows Lee to his room, then starts the conversation about not wanting to move to Boston. Patrick has a life, school, all his friends, the boat, his band, all in Manchester, while Lee is a janitor in Boston. But, Lee is not in the mood for the topic now and asks him to leave. In the middle of the night, Patrick gets down to the kitchen to look for some snacks. He then opens the fridge but ends up dropping some packs of frozen meat from the freezer. That reminds him of his father and causes him to break down. Lee comes down after hearing him and tries to help him. Patrick goes to his bedroom and after he calmed down he cried and explained that he really doesn't like the idea of his father being in the freezer. Lee sits down beside the bed until Patrick falls asleep. Flashback to the day Joe and Patrick visited Lee in Boston. Joe didn't really like the idea of Lee being a janitor, but he couldn't say anything either. He offered to buy Lee furniture, but Lee turned him down. But being the big brother he was, he still bought it for him. In the present, Lee and Patrick are in the dining room talking about the moving plan. They'll stay in Manchester until the end of school semester, and Patrick can come down in summer to work with George. Patrick still insists on not moving out and then they start arguing and screaming at each other. The next day, Lee goes back to Boston to pick up his stuff and move them to the house in Manchester. A part of him still hasn't dealt with it. He ends up punching a window with his bare fist. He's about to get a band-aid for his bleeding hand when the phone rings. It's Patrick's mom's Elise calling. Lee doesn't say anything and just hangs up on her. At night, Patrick confronts Lee about hanging up on his mom. Elise wants Patrick to have lunch with her and her fiancé in Essex. Lee explains that the reason he hung up is because he doesn't know what to say. When Lee drops Patrick at Sandy's house, Patrick asks him to talk or rather distract Sandy's mom while he and Sandy are having fun upstairs. After some convincing, Lee agrees to it, but it doesn't go as well as Patrick hoped. Lee won't say a single word to Sandy's mom, and she ends up disturbing the teenager's business as well. The next morning, Lee brings Patrick to Elise's house in Essex. There, Patrick reunites with his mother, and also meets with her fiancé, Jeffrey. They're having lunch in a rather awkward situation. Elise tries too hard to make Patrick comfortable that it ends up making him uncomfortable. On his way home, Patrick is saddened because Jeffrey doesn't really welcome him in his new household. At home, Lee is looking at Joe's hunting weapons collection when Patrick joins him. Lee has the idea of selling them to buy the new engine, and Patrick is thrilled with that idea. After they install the engine to the boat, Patrick brings Sandy to have a sail with the boat. Lee smiles in the back looking at the teens having fun. Going to town, Lee accidentally bumps into Randy and her newborn son. At first, Lee wants to excuse himself but Randy holds him, saying she wants to say something. Randy starts to cry and apologizes to Lee. She realizes that she's been saying a lot of mean things to him after the accident, and it's very wrong of her to make him suffer more. Lee tries to stop her because he still isn't ready to talk about the accident. He walks away leaving Randy crying in the middle of the street. Lee then gets drunk in the local bar, and punches a random man just because he accidentally bumps into him. Fortunately, George comes to save him, then he brings him to his house where his wife cleans Lee's wounds. A couple days later, Lee dreams about his daughters and wakes up to his house full of smoke because of his burnt cooking. In the end, Lee decides to let George adopt Patrick, so he can go back to Boston and Patrick can still have his life in Manchester. Patrick still wants to stay with him, but Lee explains that he really can't stay in Manchester, because the city reminds him of his dark past. In the spring, they bury Joe with only close family present. Lee and Patrick spend the rest of their time together. The uncle and nephew are now closer than ever. Even years after the accident, when Randy already moved on and built a new life, Lee still couldn't forgive himself for his carelessness. He couldn't even come back to Manchester without thinking of that night. He chose to punish himself by remaining alone. Subscribe to watch more videos like this, turn on notifications, and leave a like and comment to help the channel out. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.